Good evening and welcome to the Dallas Architecture Forum's panel discussion on Making Houston Modern, the life and architecture of Howard Barnstone. This is the forum's first panel of our 2021-2022 season, and we are delighted that you've joined us. Welcome. We have a distinguished group of program participants, and in a few minutes I'll introduce Kate Holliday, moderator of the panel, and then she in turn will introduce panelists Robert Barnstone, Jeffery Lieber, and Michelangelo Sabatino and begin the program. You can purchase a copy of the book, Making Houston Modern, and receive a 30% discount and free shipping at utexaspress.com. Again, that's the letter U, texaspress.com, and the discount code is UTXMHM. Again, that's UTX, like University of Texas, and then MHM, like Making Houston Modern. And now, Jean Daly will update us on forum programs, and then I'll introduce Kate.
Thank you, Nate. The forum is grateful to our panel season sponsors, and we recognize them this evening. Galaxy Modern, Purdy McGuire, Turner Construction, and Walter P. Moore. We're delighted to announce that our next lecture featuring architect Scott Specht will be presented in person on Wednesday, October 27th at the Angelica Film Center at Mockingbird Station. Please mark your calendars. We hope you will join us. Our next panel will be presented virtually on Tuesday, November the 2nd. Towards a Resilient and Emerging Mega Region, we'll discuss how architects, planners, landscape architects, and policymakers can develop solutions for challenges such as pollution, aging infrastructure, housing diversity, environmental responsiveness, climate change, and rapid population growth. Registration will open soon. Please stay tuned to our e-newsletters. We're happy to announce that architect Barbara Bester will be presenting our November lecture in person on Tuesday, November the 16th at the Angelica Film Center at Mockingbird Station. We hope you will join us. If you would like to receive AIA credit for attending this panel this evening, please email Jean at dallasarchitectureforum.org with your name and AIA number. We appreciate our forum members. If you need to renew your membership or join for the first time, please go to dallasarchitectureforum.org. Remember that with your membership, you receive free admission to all our lectures. Nate?
Kate Holliday is an architectural historian whose research and teaching focus on the built environment in American cities. She studied architecture, art history, and environmental studies at Williams College and the University of Texas at Austin, and she is a professor at the University of Texas at Arlington's College of Architecture, Planning, and Public Affairs. Kate is the author of 2 monographs on New York architects, Leopold Eislich's Architecture and Idealism in the Gilded Age, and Ralph Walker, Architect of the Century. Kate is currently at work on several projects, including the book manuscript for Telephone City, which explores the history of telephone buildings and telecommunications infrastructure. As the director of the David Dillon Center for Texas Architecture, Kate engages with the Dallas-Fort Worth architecture and historic preservation communities. She serves on the board of Historic Fort Worth and has contributed chapters to books on Texas architects O'Neill Ford and Howard Barnstone, the subject of tonight's panel. In 2020, the Texas Society of Architects awarded Kate with the Flowers Award for Excellence in Promotion of Architecture Through the Media, and the Texas Historical Commission awarded its Media Achievement Award for The Open-Ended City. The forum is pleased that Kate has moderated previous panels for us, and we're honored that she will serve as our moderator for tonight's panel on Making Houston Modern, the life and architecture of Howard Barnstone. Welcome, Kate.
It's a real pleasure to be here this evening. It's great to be back. Thank you, Nate. I appreciate it. I look forward to these panels being in person again very soon, but for now, I am really pleased to be able to introduce our panelists this evening. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. When I run through that, then I'll give you a little bit of a game plan for our discussion this evening. And so first, I want to introduce Robert Barnstone. He is an architect with a background in architectural design, in arts, and in academia. His recent scholarly research and publications are centered on architecture technologies and material science. Parallel to his involvement in sustainable material development, Barnstone has been using the design studio as a platform for civic action. This work combines his interest in hands-on learning with artistic intent and the challenges of real-world problems. His collaborative design projects range from transitional housing to vocational training for schools in Haiti and Rwanda, a food invention center, and design build projects like park weather shelters and horse barns. He complements his design work as an architect with an active career as both painter and sculptor, exploring ways of making with new materials and methods and new approaches to the depth of space, light, and texture. Robert contributed a very personal chapter to Making Houston Modern, the chapter, An Architectural Family Portrait, that discusses his relationship to his uncle, Howard Barnstone, through the lens of his own practice as an architect. Jeffery Lieber is Associate Professor of Art History at Texas State University and author of the book Flintstone Modernism, or The Crisis in Post-War American Culture, published in 2018. His essays and reviews have appeared in Architectural Histories, Texas Architect, Harvard Design Magazine, and Design and Culture. His 2018 New York Times op-ed, What Do We Lose When the Union Carbide Building Falls?, galvanized debates about the meaning of mid-20th century architecture in the US. His wide-ranging interests in the field have been supported through grants, including a Del Mas Foundation grant for independent research in Venice, and are reflected in his curation of notable film series at the Harvard Film Archive and the New School. He is a graduate of Vassar College and the University of Michigan. And Professor Lieber wrote a review of Making Houston Modern for Texas Architects that many of you may have read. Michelangelo Sabatino is professor at the Illinois Institute of Technology and leads its PhD program in architecture, where he is the inaugural John Vinci Distinguished Research Fellow. He is trained as an architect, preservationist, and historian, and throughout his career, he has focused on patterns of architectural discourse and production through the 19th and 20th centuries. His book, Pride and Modesty, Modernist Architecture and the Vernacular Tradition in Italy, published in 2011, was translated into Italian and won critical acclaim and multiple awards, including the Society of Architectural Historians Alice Davis Hitchcock Award. His recent and forthcoming books include Canada, Modern Architectures in History, and Avant-Garde in the Cornfields, Architecture, Landscape, and Preservation, and New Harmony. He served as one of the 3 editors of Making Houston Modern, The Life and Architecture of Howard Barnstone, along with Stephen Fox and Barry Scardino Bradley, and he contributed its introduction, conclusion, and a chapter on Barnstone, Mies van der Rohe, and Houston Modernism. And I want to emphasize again that UT Press is offering a discount code for your purchase of the book this evening. I'll pop that in a chat in just a little bit with the link and the code. And we would love it if you dived in a little bit more and learned more about Howard Barnstone. The game plan for this evening is for us to speak in the following order for between 5 and 10 minutes each, and then to follow up with a discussion. Jeffery Lieber will kick things off. I'll pop back on and talk a little bit about Texas modernism. Michelangelo Sabatino will then come on and talk more in depth about Houston. And then Robert Barnstone will end out with a conversation about his very personal relationship to Howard Barnstone's architecture. Just to get us started, I do want to note that I think for this largely Dallas audience, this is a really interesting project because it does suggest a model for how we can approach this really rich history of modernism in Texas and the way that it plays out in different places. And so I hope as you're listening to the conversation, you have that in the back of your head and are thinking about all of the kinds of things that we could explore in more depth here in Dallas. With that, I want to turn it over to Jeffrey to get us started.
Thanks, Kate. My favorite genre of biography takes as a subject an obscure figure whose work is relatively minor, but whose busy life is a keyhole into changing mores in a specific place and time. Making Houston Modern, the life and architecture of Howard Barnstone, falls into this category. Barnstone produced no canonical buildings and few Houston landmarks. Yet, as the essays in the book detail, he existed at the very center of an extraordinary milieu and played a role as a local architect in the diffusion of a high modernist sensibility. Driven by social as much as artistic ambition, Barnstone's life was punctuated by depressive episodes and ended in suicide. Using archival and anecdotal materials, the authors testify to his charm, but also reveal contradictions in his personality, and ultimately, what Carlos Jimenez in the foreword calls a subtle, deep-seated sadness. When Barnstone arrived in Houston in 1948, he practiced an eclectic style of modernism. As a student at Yale, he gravitated to Edward Durrell Stone, whose approach emphasized inventiveness over dogma. This ethos became a basis for Barnstone's early residential projects. Writing about the Bluxom House, which was based on Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian solar hemicycle plan, Stephen Fox observes, Barnstone's cheeky method, appropriating the master's design and literally turning it inside out, was one way to generate new designs. This cheeky method was arguably indebted to Stone's example. Nevertheless, by the early 1950s, Barnstone fell under the spell of Misesian aesthetics. The reason for this change is one of the book's main themes. Michelangelo Sabatino points to the growing popularity of Mies van der Rohe's architecture in the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s, largely thanks to the reproduction of photographs of Mies's buildings in influential magazines. In 1949, John and Dominique de Menil commissioned Philip Johnson, Mies's chief disciple, who had just completed his own Mies-inspired glass house, to design their new house in Houston. As Sabatino persuasively argues, Misesian-style modernism represented an elite ideal Barnstone longed to be identified with, whereas the egalitarian styles identified with Usonian modernism and Texas regionalism were insufficiently cosmopolitan. However, as he did with Wright's models, Barnstone toyed with Misesian principles. Fox explores this theme, explaining how Barnstone and Preston M. Bolton, his partner from 1952 to 1961, cleverly dissembled Misesian symmetry and achieved Misesian effects through what Fox calls sleights of hand. Fox suggests Barnstone exploited the representational potential of Misesian aesthetics at the expense of structural precision. And in fact, his houses were designed to showcase grand living rooms furnished with a combination of chic knoll pieces and antiques. These spaces look spectacular in photographs, and they were repeatedly published in prestigious trade magazines of the day. Barnstone's relationship with John and Dominique de Menil became the foundation of his professional and social life. Johnson balked when the Dumesnils hired the haute couturier Charles James, known for his voluminous modern ball gowns, memorably photographed by Cecil Beaton, to design the interiors of the Dumesnil house. And in the early 1950s, they needed a local architect to fine-tune it to their specifications. Hugo V. Newhouse Jr., Johnson's local associate on the project, introduced them to Barnstone. Recounting the episode, Barry Scardino Bradley states, Barnstone essentially became their in-house architect. She chronicles the projects Barnstone completed for the Dumesnils, their companies, and extended family over the next 35 years. Remarkably, they regularly called on Barnstone to modify buildings they commissioned from Johnson. In 1961, he designed an open-air barrel-vaulted canopy for the interior courtyard of the Dumesnil house, an unexpected, whimsical addition, and in truth, an improvement on Johnson's original design. In 1967, when Johnson extricated himself from the Rothko Chapel project, Barnstone and Eugene Aubrey, his partner from 1966 to 1969, took over. It was Barnstone who, in the early 1970s, convinced Dominique de Menil to preserve the bungalows that now house the Menil Foundation and to paint them gray with white trim. The Dumesnils never gave Barnstone showpiece commissions, which they reserved for eminent architects. Rather, he handled a multitude of workaday projects with a high level of competence and often great flair, but without much fuss. Another of the book's main themes is the connection between artistic modernism and political liberalism in the Houston milieu. In 1955, Barnstone married Gertrude Levy, a local actress and artist who became a central figure in the effort to desegregate Houston's schools. Olive Hershey describes their life together as glamorous and colorful, something like a Fellini movie being acted out on a Gulf Coast prairie, a wonderful image. Hershey details the marriage's unraveling after its early halcyon days. The demands of Gertrude's political activism and the racist and anti-Semitic reactions the couple faced as a result took a toll, as did Barnstone's jealousy of his wife's rising profile. Howard had begun having covert affairs with men, Hershey reveals. The couple divorced in 1969. Barnstone's commitment to progressive ideas existed in tension with his even stronger obsession with social class. He relished his role as a courtier in the Dumesnil's inner circle, and he assimilated patrician manners into his own persona. Jimenez refers to his patrician smile, and Bruce C. Webb refers to his patrician demeanor. Yet strangely, he never really assimilated patrician style into his architecture, which remained stylish rather than rigorous or truly aristocratic. That said, he integrated his patrician sensibilities and his liberal worldview in his teaching at the University of Houston, the arena in which he probably made his most consequential impact. Webb describes him as a bona fide scholar and intellectual member of the faculty. In fact, Barnstone's two books, The Galveston That Was and The Architecture of John F. Staub, Houston and the South, are beautifully written works of enduring value. The Galveston That Was helped revive interest in Galveston's historic houses and became a cri de coeur in the historic preservation movement. Kate Holliday offers a vivid description of Barnstone's lyrical yet informative writing style. In his books, Barnstone reconciled his ethical concerns, squaring his interests in social history and social class. Making Houston Modern succeeds in illuminating Barnstone's milieu and offers insights into his architecture, but it did leave me with some haunting questions. How did his suppressed homosexuality mark his life? How did it manifest in his architecture? Combined with his Jewishness, how did it factor into his perpetual feelings of ambivalence, as described by Fox and Sabatino in the introduction? In what ways did it contribute to his becoming, in Aubrey's words, the ultimate social climber? These are questions that, sadly, Barnstone himself was never able to resolve. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jeffrey. Those are questions that I know we'll come back to at the end, and they set us up for a really interesting conversation. I'm going to kind of delve a little bit more into a couple of questions that I'm going to add to our conversation here. And maybe, Jeffrey, if you can stop sharing, I'll start. Perfect. Thank you. And that's not the right screen. There we go. Still not the right. So let me ask a question real quick. Are you seeing the Rothko Chapel, or are you seeing blue?
Rothko Chapel.
Okay, perfect. I was really delighted to get the invitation to contribute to this volume on Barnstone that has such a rich collection of perspectives because of one very personal thing, which is that my husband and I were actually married in the Rothko Chapel in 1995. And so for me, this building that has such an intriguing architectural history and such an intriguing kind of mix of architectural intrigue and back and forth between architects and artists and patrons. It's a place that's really important to me on a personal level. And so trying to explore a little bit more the context for where it came from and how it fits into the career of an incredibly interesting architect and what's going on in Texas more generally was a pretty compelling kind of task to take on. I also want to add a little bit to this kind of broadening conversation about Barnstone that I think his work asks us to reconsider what we mean by modernism in Texas. And I know many of you who were present for this conversation today have this idea of a Texas modernism and a regionalism associated with Texas modernism cemented in your head through the work of someone like O'Neill Ford, and especially here in North Texas, the little chapel in the woods up in Denton, which is an absolute perfect symbol for the resolution of interest in minimalism, in new technologies, the use of parabolic arches, the use of craft, the use of regional materials, the way the building fits into the landscape, the way that the handicraft of students contributed to this collaborative work. Right there, all of these interesting things about Texas modernism that we can see in the work of O'Neill Ford and Art Swank in this particular example. And again, sticking to the North Texas side of things, this Texas regionalism that's very much associated with Ford's love of the hill country, with his mentor, David Williams' love of the hill country and his argument that there's a kind of Texanness in that architecture of Central Texas that results in these pretty wonderful vernaculars of brick standing seam roofs and informal architecture. At the same time, I want to suggest that what that does is it actually places in tension what actually happens in the next generation of Texas modernist architects, that this vernacular image of Texas as the country that had been a part of Texas literature, Texas architecture, and Texas art before World War II, and that we see expressed beautifully in popular culture in a film like Giant with James Dean out in the West Texas prairie and the culture of oil and land ownership. The writings of J. Frank Dobie, even John Graves' Goodbye to a River, right? It really locates Texas culture and Texas identity in its landscapes, right? Outside of cities, for sure. But increasingly in the post-war decades, by the 1950s and the 1960s, Texas cities are taking over. And the coming of an expanded oil industry, the coming of high tech, and some industry like Texas Instruments, the coming of NASA to Houston, really actually changes Houston's and Texas and Dallas's and the urban settings for Texas into a much more dominant mechanism for what Texas culture is supposed to be. But these two things are held in tension with each other. And I love this image on the right for the Texas Instruments advertisement of the cowboy, James Dean on his cowboy over there, looking behind him as a rocket takes off up into the atmosphere, and the horse and the cowboy are both startled, right? And for me, that's part of the tension of what Texas modern architecture becomes in the 50s and 60s, is this confrontation between the idea of a kind of rootedness in a vernacular tradition and the idea that actually there's something far more avant-garde. There's something far more forward-looking actually going on. And you can see this in the practice, not just of Barnstone, although we're certainly going to see more of that as presentations continue. But you can see that in architects across the state. And I'm just showing you very quickly one of the page spreads from the Prairie's Yields, really wonderful book by Dallas-based architects, James Pratt and Hal Box, that begins with this image of an open prairie, right? And that kind of symbolizes the origins of Texas at the same time that they are trying to understand how to make an architecture that works for downtown Dallas. And I'm showing you the cover of Texas Architect magazine from 1958 in December over there on the left side of your screen, where they write an article that's very frustrated with thinking about what context means in a city like Dallas and how you design in an urbanistic way in a city that doesn't seem to have any urbanistic traditions, right? And so they're trying to divorce themselves from the traditions of the Texas landscape at the same time that they're trying to explore the city. Same thing for someone like Richard Cauley. One of his buildings from the Civic Center complex in Corpus Christi, shown here, the City Hall, which obviously borrows from post-war European ideas about modernism and the Brise Soleil. But he's also really trying to think about Corpus Christi and the coast and what fits in there. And he is taking on the role of an avant-garde independent architect who is thumbing his nose at bureaucracy and officials at the same time that he's actually trying to have the city of Corpus Christi as a client, right? So this kind of embodied tension of the avant-garde and who an architect is actually going to serve. I think in the case of Barnstone, for me, in reading his books in particular, there's this same tension of trying to explore what is Texas to understand the place before making an urbanistic architecture. And in Barnstone's case, that involved very much exploring Galveston and exploring Houston and exploring those cities through the work of its architects. The photographs that were commissioned for the Galveston That Was book are an incredible portrait of a city through its architecture and through the eyes of two very different photographers. And his book on Staub is really remarkable in the way that he reads what looks like really traditional architecture as something that's actually being quite responsive and functional to the particular conditions of Houston as a city. And so for me, when I see a kind of comparison of images like this, and this is the Gartner House in Fort Worth by Staub, and then on the other side, Barnstone's Winterbottom House in Houston, there's actually a remarkable kinds of synergy between the two, and that in Barnstone's exploration of history, and particularly his exploration of Texas history and Texas architects, he's looking carefully at architectural traditions that aren't from the Hill Country, that aren't the traditions that Williams and Ford had explored, and helping to kind of bolster the case for a really robust tradition of Texas architecture that can give rise to a Texas modernism And I would just say the blank wall here on the front of the Gartner House focused almost exclusively on the doorway, in the same way that the only opening here, and clearly this modernist pavilion on the right, that there's a kind of, clearly it's not copied. That's not what I'm trying to argue here, but there is a reading of the architects who've come before him in the Texas context that allows him to build into a Texas modern tradition. I will stop there. I will stop sharing my screen. And Michelangelo, please take it away.
Do you see me? Okay,
Yes.
Great. So, well, thank you. And before I jump in for a quick overview, I'd like to, of course, thank Kate for all of her efforts in reeling us in, and Nate as well. This is especially meaningful because I know, after having lived in the Lone Star State, there is a subtle and enduring rivalry with Houston. So I'm glad you're giving Houston some sort of FaceTime, so to speak. Of course, my two co-editors, co-authors, Stephen Fox and Barry Scordino Bradley, are not with us tonight. We have a considerable group of authors that contributed to this book, including, of course, Kate and Robert. And so we thought that as we move forward, it would be a great idea to try to showcase their contributions as well. So, Kate, tell me, I'm going to try very hard to stay within the 10 minutes, and you can boot me off if I get a little too verbose.
I'll wave my hands.
This book was in the making for a number of years. And so the idea was that we could do equal parts architecture, equal parts biography, hence the life in architecture. To the right, an image we've already seen, Howard and Gertrude. Their contribution to the Houston milieu is significant on multiple fronts, cultural as well as architectural. But the Houston that we have grown to love and some hate is the Houston defined by its bigness, its highways, and its iconic Astrodome. It's within this context that Howard Barnstone, who arrived from the East Coast after an education at Yale, began to navigate. As Kate mentioned, Houston's sort of identity lay somewhere in between the sort of oil well gushers at Beaumont and the space cowboys. And so it's within this very sort of wealthy, sort of resource rich context that Barnstone is able to identify very important patrons of his work. Of course, it was Rayner Banham that said that outside of Chicago, Houston was the most Misesian city in America. And I'm sort of privileged to have gone from living in Houston to Chicago, ironically, just as the book was being completed. So I have 2 feet in different cities, so to speak. To the left, the original Cullinan Hall, Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, 1958, and the subsequent Brown Pavilion. And so not only did Mies impact the fabric of the city through the work of Philip Johnson and, of course, Howard Barnstone, he was directly and indirectly able to exercise considerable influence on the architecture of the city. But let's just take a step back. This Architectural Forum article published in the July 1958 issue brings together sort of unlikely partners. On the top is the Graff's house, designed by Edward Durrell Stone, and to the bottom is the Haggerty House, designed by O'Neill Ford. So already within the context of Dallas, you have these tensions developing between a kind of classically inspired villa-like, as it's described, house, single-family house, and the more sort of hacienda style, is this at least what the author referred to it. And so this tension that Jeffrey mentioned between the democratic underpinnings of the kind of Usonian modern Texas regionalism and the kind of cosmopolitan, classically inspired architecture is present in Dallas in equal parts, as it would be very much so in Houston. And just to give you a very concrete example, just as the O'Neill Haggerty House was being completed in 1958, Bolton and Barnstone, Bolton being the first partner, significant partner of Barnstone, completed the Desmoustiers House, which, as you see here, is a steel frame, painted white, not unlike the Cullen Hall, with brick, tan brick that would become the signature for Mies, and especially on the IIT campus where I am sitting in my office in the building, the former Institute of Gas Technology, right immediately south of Crown Hall. And further in Houston, we continue to see this tension between the sort of Miesian-inspired Anderson Todd House on his first, on Shadow Lawn Circle of 1961, and the Cynthia Woods and George Mitchell House by McKee and Camrath. And sadly, the latter has been demolished. And this is just a sideline, but one significant nonetheless. You know, as we all know, the ravages of real estate development have put many of these modernist houses with the smallish footprints in peril. And so the kind of ideal of the middle and upper class in terms of what they required in terms of space, as we know, has considerably changed over the years. Jeffrey mentioned milieu, fundamental to the Barnstone's ability to thrive and present the greater Houston and American public. His work was the relationship that he had with the de Menils. Here we see a wonderful photo with Dominique on the right with Barnstone. This, of course, with Andy Warhol present, a trip that they had taken to one of my other homelands, Canada, the Montreal Expo Exposition of 1961. To the left, of course, is the Renzo Piano and Richard Fitzgerald Menil collection. Here we see an extension of the Mies, Johnson, Barnstone trajectory into the very recent decades. A view of Barnstone and Gertrude looking very glamorous in Cullen Hall, and an occasion of an opening of an exhibition. At the center of Barnstone's activity as an architect, a writer, and as an educator was the Gerald Hines, former, now Gerald Hines, but the Hines College of Architecture, which was the epicenter of modern architecture in Houston, to be sure. To the left, we see Johnson lecturing, a sort of a view of what appears to be Alva Aalto's portrait, and then Barnstone in the middle with Bucky Fuller, Bartholomew. And so Barnstone cultivated a rather stimulating milieu through his presence at the University of Houston. Here we see much later date Barnstone to the far left with Johnson, Berge, in an occasion of what might be seen as a betrayal of all the early experimentation of modern architecture in the Gerald D. Hines, Ledoux-inspired college to the lower right. As we said, Barnstone was trained at Yale, and he opted significantly to study or complete his thesis with Edward Durrell Stone instead of Kahn, seeing in Durrell Stone an opportunity for much more open-ended, less restricted experimentations. He could do what he wanted, as he once recounted to Stephen Fox. One of his early most significant works is the Barbara and Alvin Owsley Junior House on a bayou. Here we can see how he takes the Miesian pavilion and he sort of expands it to create a building that recalls this sort of Mississippi sort of great boats with the sort of decks surrounding it. And so clearly, on the one hand, he embraces Miesian architecture, but he carefully tempers that, translates that, as I've spoken about before, to the context of Houston. He paints it, as we can see from this rare Bethlehem steel advert to the upper right. He paints it yellow or yellow-green. So for anyone looking for Miesian orthodoxy, they are going to be terribly disappointed. In fact, that is the whole point. When Jeffrey was referring to stylishness, there's always more of that than orthodoxy. Here we see the view. Here too, he merges two-story high living room ceiling with more conventional rooms. Here is an early sort of advert that shows a wonderful kind of axonometric. Barnstone we're almost there, combines research with practice. His Staub book is an important one, as is his one for Galveston. I'm convinced, and I'll say this, I wrote about it, Galveston is more than just a place where Victorian piles inhabit. The nostalgia, the sort of eerie nostalgia of Galveston feeds into, I believe, Barnstone's nostalgia. And I will say, perhaps I'll move forward. Kate, I have a couple minutes left, or should I? Okay, forget this. We're going to go to Meyer, still extant. Here we see the beautiful high ceilings against the natural background, inspired, of course, by the Schlumberger and Boissonnas New Haven Johnson House. So Johnson is all the time the presence, even more than Mies, in Barnstone's oeuvre. It's clear here the work that Johnson did at the University of St. Thomas campus, and again the circle with the Dimonels that continues. And then finally, two more works that show that Barnstone was always interested in the vernacular. After his partnership with Bolton dissolved, he went on to partner with Jean Aubrey. He did a number of significant works, including this Bay House, Barnhart Bay House, and also the Kempner House, that takes the vernacular to yet a different level. And then finally, one of his proteges, although it's unlikely, but in terms of the intellectual, the kind of generous mindset, curiosity that all architects should embrace, of course, is Carlos Jimenez, who wrote the foreword. And I will conclude with that, thanking again my beloved co-authors, Barry Scardino and Stephen, who taught me everything I know about Texas modern architecture. Thank you, Kate.
Great, thank you. I know there's so many great buildings and images that I know, Robert, you're going to show some more and kind of launch us in another direction.
So shall I stop screening, Kate?
Yeah, you stop sharing and then Robert can start.
Okay, so I'm having stop share. Okay,
yeah, perfect.
Great.
And you just need to unmute, Robert. Yeah, we still can't hear you with the muting. Let me see if I can find.
Mute. Is
Okay.
that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, perfect. All right. I'm going to talk about a series of buildings. Sorry, I just have to kind of, I think every computer should come with a 15-year-old to help figure out how to get from one thing to another. Here, let me see. There we go. See if I can get this to play. All right, from the wrong slide, of course. Okay, I'm going to begin the talk tonight talking about the house that I actually grew up in. I'm sorry, I'm going backwards here, but Howard came out to Bloomington, Indiana, where I grew up, Indiana University. My father's a professor of comparative literature, and my mother's a painter. Ellie and Howard shared something that Willis didn't actually share. They were both very involved in World War II. Howard as an intelligence officer in the Pacific Islands, and Ellie as a victim of occupied Greece, running the whole world of the underground. But so when they discussed creating a house, Ellie said she wanted something very maintenance-free, very simple painting studio, a study for Willis to do his work in. And Howard at that point was fascinated with solar architecture. He wanted to do a solar building, and this is 1962. And you know, that's quite early to have that sort of perspective on doing something which is very regional and so forth. And so if we were to interpret this building in today's terms, we would see that it is an extraordinarily sustainable building. It's, we found an old barn. Howard looked around Indiana and thought Willis said, well, I could buy that house for something. And Howard would say, you could live there. I couldn't live there. But I remember as a child, we found this barn. It was given to us. We moved it for $200, and then using local rough sawn oak, we clad the whole building. The entry sequence to the house is a circular driveway, typical of the Mather house and many of the other houses that we've seen, and it is on a ridge, so you come down the hill, and the house reveals itself as you come down the hill and drive between the house and the garage. And you have this black awning, very modernist awning. And of course, Howard was known, when we say unorthodox architecture, Howard, even in the Mather house and so forth, would use redwood painted black as opposed to steel. And people felt that was a real betrayal of Misesian ideals and purism and so forth. But the effect was quite similar. The house, the entry sequence to the house is you come in the front doors, and rather than entering onto the main level, you're actually entering onto a split level. My mother's studio there on the right is that's her painting studio, but you go up a short flight of stairs which have these huge long treads, 16-inch treads coming up with very, very low rises, and you come up this very grand staircase into this beautiful hayloft area, and you can see all of the rafters there, the oak rafters from the barn. Coming back down the staircase, you would have this large window above the double door, looking back out and coming from the downstairs, you would see that as well. Downstairs was a open plan, 3 bedrooms on one side with 2 bathrooms and a horseshoe shaped kitchen environment. The house is passive solar, And so the sun comes into the living room space, it's captured within a heating system, taken down to a concrete slab, which is actually built into the ground. And the air ducts run through the concrete slab, heating up that concrete slab and then radiating the air back into the house overnight. The house is incredibly cheap to heat. There's no maintenance because the exterior has never been painted. It's 60 years old and it has still never been painted. All of the decks are redwood, and the roof and walls are not only have insulation within the walls, but also have an insulation panel on the exterior, a Celotex panel. So it is actually a super insulated house by even today's standards. So here we are looking up into the glass wall, and you can see that there is almost no sunlight coming in the summertime, because the trees, which are literally 15 stories, 150 feet all the way around the house, create this amazing canopy of dappled light. But the presence of this, what we would say magical space, is Howard would describe it. And this is really about nature and an extraordinary space coming together. And this is typical of Howard's sensibilities. I just wanted to read a quick note here. From a practice point of view, there were three strengths in Howard's work. One was his versatility and range, and we're going to look at that now. Evident in his ability to synthesize elements from different architectural traditions into a coherent whole, sensitivity to sight, nature, and a fascination, even obsession, with the automobile as a constituent element of modern design. The thread connecting these strengths was Howard's ability to imbue every aspect of his work with what he called magic, engaging the occupants of his buildings emotionally, whether because of the architecture's stunning relationship to nature, to the natural environment, or because of his mesmerizing treatment of interior and exterior spaces. He also claimed that we are free of the old guard, and that because we are free of the old guard, there is certainly a new generation of horrors, which he was very clear about, and in some of his later work, I would say he engaged in the worst of the postmodern period. Looking back to the house, here we have Willis's study upstairs and then the entrance downstairs. On the front facade, you have balconies off of the study, off of the bedroom. And here is the living room, looking up with this lovely little triangular window. And the reason he raises the roof on this side is also to have a large return for the air to go back down into the concrete slab. On the left-hand side here in this slide, we can see the 3-bedroom windows down below, and basically the siding in the garage and so forth. The back.
Robert, is there kind of a final point that you wanted to make before we have a little bit of opportunity for the audience to ask some questions?
Yeah, let me continue. I'll just zap through some of these other slides if you don't mind. I'll go quickly. Have I done 10 minutes already?
Yes.
Really? Jesus. Okay. All right. Well, I'm just going to zap through. Here we can see the various balconies, multiple balconies stretching off of the house. This is a house for Marty. And again, in that modernist situation, always courtyards, always fenced elements, similar to Philip Johnson's Cambridge house, his first thesis project. This is a second project for Marty, also in that modernist tradition, but following the typical hacienda. Here we have a motor motel, I should say. And there's a modernist cruciform plan with this almost sauna-like situation on the exterior. Here are these very, very plastic walls showing the bar elements there and so forth. And then what I find so interesting here are these units. So here we have this glass box, and if you look very closely, this is just a glass wall here and a glass wall here, two glass walls looking into the garden. And again, a similar situation here with these lovely gardens set into these units. There's a better picture of it where you can see that. Again, more of that. He worked with my uncle Robert, who was a developer, almost mayor of Houston, council member, and in this project, the Esplanade, he had made this sort of Italian mountain village, but with a combination of wood, stucco, steel, any number of different materials. And then the last project I'm going to show is the house for Marty. It's a 5-story, totally asymmetrical home. Certainly not anything like the 2 earlier homes that Howard had designed for her. And he developed the series of black louver doors, large louver doors, all looking out to the sea in these 2 elevations, much blanker elevations on this side, but with the staircase stepping outside of the volume of the building and moving up. And this the stairwell pop out there. These are the staircases looking up through it. And of course, it has this sort of, Barragan-esque series of wooden rafters and very complex, wonderful plan. I'll leave it there. Okay, that's it.
Great,
Sorry
thank
for
you. No. So what I'll say is that for anyone who wants more, the book is your answer, right? Because you're going to get more of it there. We're giving you a little bit of a teaser. And I know it's incredibly painful with all these incredible images and designs just to just dip in like this. I know we're close to the end of our time, but I actually wanted to try to connect a question that Jeffrey asked at the beginning to Robert, what you were kind of discussing, which is the connection of who Howard was as a person to the way that he designed space and designed buildings and the kind of connection between the two. And I don't know if either of you have some kind of follow-up thoughts on that. And audience members, if you have questions that you would like us to try to entertain, please put them in the chat and we'll either get to them this evening or, if we can, we'll try to follow up with you if we completely run out of time.
Well, I can tell you this, Howard was obsessive in every way. His manic depression created radical obsessions, whether they were positive or negative. And his obsession with architecture was constant. You would drive in the car with him and he would not look at the road. He would look at the buildings as we moved along, and he would point out at every moment. Of course, I was in a way his protege. I worked for him, and he would constantly just tell me little things. Light switches should be at this height. The cantilever, wood can cantilever this far. It could, and they were, little moments of intelligence that he constantly sort of came back to. And I think that you can see that throughout many of his buildings. You can see the consistent use of lights as a particular kind of attribute to most of the buildings. The Rothko Chapel, good example. The Winterbaum House, many of the buildings are, have certain Howard aspects, and they actually could be identified very clearly. And anyone else want to answer that?
I wonder, back to Jeffrey's point, Robert, you raised the magic part, right? There was a kind of, there was also an intimate Howard. And I wonder if one thinks of architectural terms, there was never full transparency. There was always a kind of multiplicity of options within his architecture. So I wonder if that is is possible to be a kind of approach to his psyche. I don't know. That's just 2 cents. Jeffrey, is that ridiculous for me to say?
No, I'll add for those that are interested in delving into the book, magic and Barnstone's magic comes up, I think, in both Stephen Fox's essay and in Barry Scardino Bradley's essay. And there's a wonderful quote by Stephen about the way Barnstone sort of, orchestrates this sort of magic at the Schulenberger Austin Research Center, and particularly in the Broadway walkway. I mean, I don't really have the answers to the questions that I posed at the end of my talk.
Mhm.
I do, and I'm also not as, sort of deeply entrenched in the Barnstone archive as you all are. That said, I do feel that somehow Johnson, Barnstone's either admiration for Johnson or his hero worship of Johnson is a key to the answer to those questions. And it's very interesting to me that, Johnson's architecture has a very particular syntax. He's using the Misesian vocabulary, but Johnson's architecture is so different from Mises' architecture. Like, where does the difference lie? That I think that the difference lies primarily like in the syntax, sort of in the grammar of the way he puts the forms together. That's what I'd be interested to look at with Barnstone's, particularly the residential projects. And, there's a certain like inflection in Johnson's use of all these forms that he himself describes in very, witty and frankly, like gendered and sexual ways in his lectures. That's Johnson. And so again, I'd be interested just to sort of do a study of like Barnstone's architectural syntax and to see if there's anything there. And then I also think there's something about, Michelangelo, you mentioned multiplicity. And in the book, both you and Stephen talk quite a bit about, the way Barnstone's Jewishness, his ambivalent feelings about, his Jewishness and his sort of ambivalent feelings about his sexuality, do create quite a number of contradictions. He takes oppositional attitudes towards sort of mainstream trends and views. And I think there's something really interesting just in those oppositional attitudes and in the contradictions, in his willingness to dramatize those contradictions in his architecture. That's, quite provocative and interesting.
Right.
So, these are, for me, some of the keys to those questions and the links between the personal and the sort of in the architecture.
Right. As an aside note, this is for the audience, just a bit of the sausage making behind the book. We had insisted that the title be Magical Modernism. And our editor, who was a fabulous, excellent editor, Robert Devins at UT Austin Press, they weren't buying it.
It's such a great title. It was the perfect title.
Right. And I guess now I can go back and re-ask Robert once over margaritas that unfortunately I'm not sharing with you tonight in Texas. Why exactly there was pushback to that when it seems, so I guess that's the publisher's prerogative to decide on titles, and God knows how many different, what different kind of considerations are made. But in any case, Jeffrey, I think that now you're an adoptive Texan. I think you have understood so much of this book, and perhaps you're going to pick up on some threads that we left perhaps unresolved or partially resolved. And so you can come follow up where we left off.
Yeah, and so I hate to cut off the conversation because there's a lot more we could talk about, I know, but I know we're at the end of our time. And again, I want to urge anyone here who Barnstone is absolutely fascinating. There's a ton of interesting information in the book. And I really do, for this Dallas audience, really want to say that this does provide a kind of model for how we can explore some of our own practitioners from multiple points of view together. I love that this book has historians, practitioners, family members, bringing different parts of the story together in one place. And so I would recommend the book highly.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a little prejudiced, but I would still recommend it highly. And Nate, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you for having us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks all of you. I mean, I think you kind of just cracked the cover of the book, and everyone needs to get their copy to really delve more into this amazing life. And and though we wish we could be in person, I mean, it's pretty amazing to me. We have our panelists tonight actually from Australia, Chicago, Austin, and here locally. So some advantages to Zoom, but we look forward to being back together soon. Quick shout out to Preservation Dallas, Docomomo, North Texas, and Mod Texas for helping promote the panel. And thanks to all of you for viewing this. And again, special thanks to Michelangelo, Jeffrey, Robert, and Kate. Amazing job about a very fascinating person and some amazing projects that have really shaped Houston and beyond in the architectural vernacular. I hope to see all of you on the 27th for the Scott Specht lecture that will be in person at the Angelica Film Center. And until then, thank you again. Good night.
Good night to everyone. And thank you.
Thank you.